Hello, my name is Lucy and it's really wonderful to be back at this year's Boat Electrons Festival and Symposium for the second year in a row, virtually. Today I'm going to talk about multi-user instruments. There's so many different ways that one can approach multi-user instruments, both conceptually and practically. So I personally find them to be very fascinating, particularly in the context of interactive music technology and embodied music technology. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll also be inspired to explore multi-user instruments if you haven't already. So basically, a multi-user instrument is pretty much what it sounds like. It's an instrument where the sonic output is shaped by two people simultaneously. Now, this is by no means a new concept in electronic and electroacoustic music. Music is this, in some ways, intangible thing that humans just tend to want to experience together, not alone in isolation. And so there are naturally many acoustic instruments that are intended to be played by two or more people at the same time. One example that will be quite familiar to those of you in the music community at UCT is the Kiganda Amadinda, which is a xylophone, for those of you who don't know, where one musician sits on either side and the first musician starts playing a melody in constant pulsation, and the musician on the other side then starts to play a different melody, also in constant pulsation, but at the opposite temporal location of the other one. So the two pulses interlock, and then together there is a resulting melody formed by those two players, even though neither player plays every note of the first melody, and there could also be a third player kind of doubling that melody in the upper register. So in this way, all three musicians are playing the same instrument all at once. Each musician's experience of playing is equally valid and important, and there's no one right way to experience. From the perspective of someone watching and listening, you can pick out different melodies, and from the perspective of each musician playing, each will hear the pulse in a different location. So I think that really clearly speaks to just different embodied perceptions that can be explored and approached through multi-user instrument practices. Even more so maybe than in ensemble music. In an electroacoustic context, there are also a lot of multi-user instrument examples, and I'll mention just a couple of them to provide some context in case you don't know. And I'll include a little bibliography slide at the end of this presentation so that you have something to refer back to, but you don't need to, keep track too much while you watch the video. So a really early example is John Cage's Imaginary Landscape No. 4, of course, for 12 radios and 24 performers. In this piece, the performers are kind of manipulating the tuning and volume of each radio and playing the whole system like one multi-user instrument, and they're following a score composed by John Cage. Another early example is Stockhausen's Microphony No. 1, where the sound of acoustic instruments, in this case two tam-tams, is captured through microphones that are held and kind of manipulated by two more performers, and then that captured sound is further processed in real time through filters, filtering controlled by 2 more players. And this kind of modality can be a really useful way to incorporate multi-user instruments in the improvisation community as well. It doesn't just have to be with pre-composed pieces. For example, there's a lot of work where one musician plays an acoustic instrument or a synthesized instrument through, for example, a Eurorack, and then the Eurorack is then played by another player. And then in that sense, both musicians are interacting with the same resulting output sound. There are many other modalities within the multi-user instrument context. For example, there's Charu Erdem's Frankt, which is a multi-user instrument played by a dancer and a musician. So the dancer's movements are captured with EMG electromyographic muscle sensors, which detect the electrical impulses in the muscles. And then this data is sonified in real time and in MaxMSP, and then this sonification of the movement data is further processed by the musician, who can access it through a MIDI keyboard connected to MaxMSP. There's a lot more examples. If you would like to get started with multi-user instruments, I also recommend you check out the NIME, New Interfaces for Musical Expression conference. And all the proceedings are just available online for anyone to read. You don't even need institutional access. So if you don't know about that conference already, definitely go check it out. So the musical work that percussionist Ben Brown and I made collaboratively for Bode Electrons 2022 does center on a multi-user instrument. And of course, that's why I'm talking about multi-user instruments. But this is not my first, it's not my first multi-user instrument experiment. I first became interested in multi-user instruments in 2020 when a whole lot of us musicians all around the world, of course, began to really deeply explore telematic performance and networked music. Of course, these practices have existed for a long time and are, there's a lot of research done on them before the pandemic started. But that's the first time I started working with telematic performance. And I noticed on the Bode Electrons program that there's also going to be a presentation on distributed ensembles. And so I think that multi-user instruments actually tie in really well with that, because the history of networked ensembles, network music, and multi-user instruments are really closely linked. An early example of both is the League of Automatic Composers in the 1970s, who performed with the idea that their network was simultaneously a multi-user instrument and also an ensemble made up of individual instruments. And this kind of juxtaposition or scale between ensemble and multi-user instrument has always been, at least in my experience, very present in my mind when I've played multi-user instruments and designed them. So the first multi-user instrument project that I worked on was a telematic performance piece called Instance, in collaboration with a really wonderful musician and dancer that many of you in the UCT community know, called Sumalji Neuro. In Instance, we extended the telematic interface to facilitate the playing of an electroacoustic multi-user instrument over the internet in such a way that we could use music and dance to control the instrument together. So I played viola in Vancouver, Canada, while Suma danced in Cape Town, South Africa. And we also worked on the piece a bit while he was in Mozambique, so it spanned a distance of 16,500 kilometers, which is quite a big instrument, I think. Yeah, the way that we did this, the way it worked, was we used some gesture tracking technology called PoseNet. It's quite similar to using a Kinect camera in that you can track movement and get the coordinates of different joints of the body in relation to the camera, except that PoseNet can just use an existing 2D image or video and doesn't work in 3D like an infrared camera like Kinect. So we kept things as simple as we could in terms of the sensor hardware that we used, and we just had a Zoom call and used a screen capture to send the video of Suma dancing through PoseNet to get the coordinates of different joints of his body. And so those values were the input for Suma to control the instrument through dance. And we also had my live viola audio and some pre-recorded mbira samples as audio material that Suma had recorded. And we used the Pipo Tilde library in Max MSP to analyze the incoming viola audio in real time. So we could extract audio features like loudness, periodicity, and fundamental frequency, for example, and then use these changing values to change parameters of the viola and pre-recorded mbira audio in real time. We used pretty natural sonic transformations like granular synthesis and ring modulation, and then we also had some audio manipulations in the time domain. That was just a bit of background on my past work on multi-user instruments, but if you want to know more about Instance and you want to, read about all the details, I published a paper in collaboration with Suma and our colleague Kavanch Tatar, and there you can read all about the project. I'll also include that info in the bibliography slide at the end of this video. One of the things that I love most about designing, making, and playing multi-user instruments, and that I first began to explore in Instance and, now in SimBody, the project for Build Electrons this year. That was a long sentence. One of the things that I really love about making these systems are all the design considerations and decisions that can really influence the overall experience of someone playing and listening to and watching someone play a multi-user instrument. So one consideration is the balance of controls. For example, if you have a piano where someone is playing the notes and then someone else is preparing the piano with objects, then how does that shape the agency within the interaction? One person is responsible for activating the sound, and then another person can only manipulate the sound, but neither person can do anything without the other. But the notes that are played are very determined by one person, but the sound quality then and the resulting kind of sound is really dependent on the decisions of another person. Another example, if you play an acoustic instrument through a modular synthesizer, or if you play your own synth through a modular synthesizer that someone else is then manipulating, then that person gets to control the entire the second person gets to control the entire resulting audio output. And so, you know, what does that mean for agency, and, you know, who gets to have a say, and how much of a say does each player get to have in the sound that comes out? Because you're standing there on stage making the sound, so, you know, in a sense, as a performer, you feel really responsible and kind of attached to whatever sound you intend. So yeah, I guess there's a lot of vulnerability in multi-user instrument control that needs to be taken into consideration in the design process. You know, power dynamics. Another interesting one that I like to consider is the asymmetry or symmetry of input controls. For example, the music dance instrument that I mentioned earlier, franked, and also instance, which is a music dance instrument. You know, this relates really closely to action and sound and the way that humans perceive sound. There have been a lot of studies that show that the way we perceive a sound is dependent not only on, you know, what we hear, but also how we perceive the sound producing action. So the same sound produced in different ways, even if it's exactly the same sound, we'll perceive it differently. So what does it mean for, you know, if the sound producing actions are so different for each player? I think that can lead to really interesting results on how we perceive sound through a multi-user instrument, compared to if you just have, you know, two string players each doing pretty similar actions to produce sound together, for example. Like I mentioned before, the work that I made for Boat Electrons this year with Ben Brown centers on the concept of a multi-user instrument. The setup is quite simple. I play viola, we capture that live audio with a microphone, then send that audio through my computer in Max MSP, where some things might happen. It gets output into a transducer, which converts audio energy into mechanical energy. Yeah, this is the one we use. It's a... have to show you my skincare routine like a YouTuber. It's a Dayton Audio bass shaker. Turns out the gaming community has transducers all figured out for haptic feedback. Yeah, anyway, the transducer is then attached to a cymbal or a drum, which produces sound when it's excited by the transducer. So at the same time, another musician, in this case percussionist Ben Brown, plays the cymbal with a stick or a bow, or sometimes his foot. And in this way, the sound is a product of both of our sound producing actions. On my laptop, as per usual, I'm running Max MSP and keeping it really simple with just a bit of pitch shifting. For future SimBuddy experiments, SimBuddy is the name of the piece we made. We would like to use, for future experiments, we'd like to use a bit more sound processing, you know, maybe have Karma tilde external running so that we, you know, come back to similar motifs at different times. But for the purposes of these early experiments, it was really important for us to simplify the interaction, to explore, you know, small details in real time about sound producing actions. There's already so much to concentrate on when playing a multi-user instrument. You know, there's a whole other person to play with. In this case, you're also trying to play your own instrument, and then also, you know, it's like playing two instruments at once in a way. So yes, we kept the sound processing a little bit simple this time. With just the viola and cymbal sound, or drum sound, we found that the piece was conceptually and aesthetically a little bit lopsided. So although we kept it really simple, we did do a little bit, we added something in the pipeline to rectify the symmetry, which is a design consideration that I mentioned earlier. Because I could interact with the drum sound and the viola, but the drummer could only interact with the sound of the cymbal. So in order to insert some kind of interaction between the drummer and the audio going into the transducer, we used a pulse signal from the drummer's earlobe. And for this, we used a photoplethysmographic PPG pulse monitor. Skincare routine again. So this little pulse monitor just shines some ambient light into the body, and then this is the little light, and then it reads the light that bounces back into the sensor, because as your heart beats, the volume of blood ebbs and flows throughout your body, especially in your extremities like your fingertips and your earlobes. And since blood absorbs light, the PPG sensor receives the changes in the intensity of the light bouncing back. So yeah, it gives a kind of modulating value in accordance with your pulse. So we just very simply connected the rising and falling of Ben's pulse from his earlobe as an amplitude modulation on the level of the viola audio that was being sent to the transducer. We found that this created an interesting undulating effect that one could liken to a very slow cyclical vibrato. And by modulating the viola audio, we managed to give the piece a pulse, Ben's pulse, but we didn't have to have like a beat that was going constantly. And of course, you know, as Ben moved around more and got more excited about the music, his pulse would change how fast it was beating. So you know, it would just kind of add to the direction of the music that we made. Yeah, and working within the technical framework of this interactive system or multi-user instrument, the piece is otherwise improvised, because Ben and I are both really passionate about improvisation and instant composition. And within this improvisational structure that we had, I think the listener can perceive the shifts between when we play more like an ensemble and when we play more like a multi-user instrument. We're always doing both, but it's really on a scale. And that's what, I mean, that made it really exciting to perform and play. So far, Ben's and my experience of playing this instrument together has been really multifaceted, and I think we've both left our workshop and recording sessions feeling really satisfied with what we created, but also super inspired to explore more the next time we meet. Some of the things that we found interesting were different ways that we could use the transducer to activate the drums. So I think this was maybe heightened because we play a, you know, instrument that's generally capable of sustain, the viola, and then percussion, which, you know, is kind of basically known for more staccato kind of sound qualities, though of course both instruments are capable of much more. Yes, but we, yeah, in terms of ways we could activate the drums, sometimes we used the transducer to create more staccato attacks, almost like someone hitting the drum or cymbal, and other times we could use it to play really sustained notes that sounded almost like singing into the bass drum. So it's all dependent on a lot of different factors, like the level of audio going into the transducer. For example, sometimes if it's really loud, it creates a buzzing or even rattling effect. When I played a sustained viola note, that on the viola was very beautiful and not rattling. And so initially when we started working on the project, I thought we would try to fix the transducer to a specific place on the drum or cymbal and then bring out different resonant nodes depending on, where we placed it. But then Ben and I, both being really interested in music and movement and how they interrelate in our own ways, we really loved how the transducer moves about and kind of dances all over the drum or cymbal as we play. And so that became, this element that we were kind of keeping track of throughout our workshops and play sessions. Another thing that we found really interesting was to do with the pitch shift, because I was pitch shifting the incoming viola audio before sending it out to the transducer. So one of the transducers that we used, which is the bass shaker that I showed earlier, it's able to produce really, really low frequencies because it's used for haptic feedback in the gaming community to simulate, what it feels like to drive a race car. So it was very effective at transducing sound that's pitch shifted 2 octaves below the viola audio. And at this output range, the pitch actually transforms into rhythm. Maybe it's just this particular bass shaker. So of course this was a really fun angle to explore in a project that makes use of percussion. If you watch our Symbody video in tonight's concert, you'll also notice some points where we pitch shift the viola down only 1 octave and send that into a bass drum. And that ends up being really effective because that's exactly in the bass drum range. And from here, Ben started to explore tuning the bass drum while we played. And he told me apparently that's something he hasn't ever tried, while playing during a performance before this project. So I was extremely happy to hear that, because I particularly love when we use music technology to enrich our existing practices. On the topic of pitch once more, it was really interesting from my perspective to find out which notes were resonant on each individual drum and cymbal. It was really strange for me at first because a lot of those notes were usually different from the most resonant and open notes that I could play on my viola, which are usually, of course, the pitch classes of the open strings. So in the video, you'll hear me play a lot of B naturals, which is it's a rather closed, tight note on my viola, but ended up being an extremely resonant note on a couple of the drums and cymbals that we used. Other things we ended up considering in the Symbody workshops were how we angled the instrument in relation to the camera. So at one point, Ben played the transducer, he placed the transducer behind the cymbal, so the viewer couldn't actually see what he was doing. So in this case, at this point, the sound producing actions are just a total mystery and largely up to your imagination as a viewer. At another point, we also started exploring the movement of the drums and the viola. And this actually led to some experimentation with feedback, which was quite spontaneous. and then to us both touching the drums and the transducer, while I also continued to play viola to activate the transducer. So this is kind of this moment where the boundaries between whose instrument is whose is without boundaries crossed. And yeah, I think in terms of embodied music technology, there's also this, you know, in music pedagogy, we often speak about how the instrument should become an extension of your body and, you know, all that. But then when playing a multi-user instrument, it's kind of like someone is interfering with this extension of your body, and, you know, who's at different times the instrument becomes more one person's an extension of one person's body than the others. So I guess that's something that maybe I'll explore a little bit more, an angle I'll explore a bit more with Ben in future experiments. Yeah, most of what I just spoke about in relation to the SimBody project, these are all insights that we came to through just happy accidents. I actually started holding the transducer because it fell on the floor and I just wanted to pick it up and put it back on the drums. But then I made some little sonic discoveries along the way between the floor and the drums, and I just started playing with them. So yeah, I hope that what I spoke about today shows how useful and important a playful creative practice can be in the context of music technology, and also how we can use technology as a way to enrich and extend our existing practice. Yeah, in case you haven't gathered by now, what the video that Ben and I submitted for the festival is, well, we structured it as like a series of little vignettes of you know, just chronologically depicting our exploration as we made discoveries in real time of the of how we could use this transducer as a multi-user instrument with viola and drums. So yeah, it's not necessarily something that I would consider live performance ready, but I think in the context of this festival and symposium, I think that it's really nice to share this stage of the gestalt of our early experiments. Yeah, that's kind of everything. Before I end the presentation, I of course want to thank Prof. Herbst and Matt Pratt for running the festival and just kind of making everything happen. Yeah, since this presentation was all about multi-user instruments, I'd also like to thank all the people I've ever played multi-user instruments with. So thank you Sumalji Neuro, who played the digital music dance instrument with me in Instance. And thank you Ben Brown for playing the multi-user instrument with me in our performance at this festival. It was really wonderful to have someone to collaborate with who is just so curious and, you know, keen to explore with me. I'd also like to thank Adrian Avendano, who is another wonderful percussionist who first showed me that it's possible to use a cymbal as a resonant speaker with a transducer. I've really learnt so much from artistic exchanges with all of these people. Yeah, thanks for watching, and I really hope that I can join you in person at UCT for a future about electrons in the future.